Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis here. This week, we start week 2, and you'll notice over on the content side of your class page, you'll notice that you can now see a module area for week 2. Select that module area to see all of the content for this week, including your readings and assignments, including the discussion forum, and so forth. Of course, including my video lectures. Remember, every week I have video lectures for the class, and the video lectures will really help to understand the material we're covering. So I highly recommend watching these video lectures and taking notes on them. It will really help as we move forward to our first test, which is coming up pretty soon. This week we're reading chapter 3, and the subject for this week, we're going to be looking at first the development of the Atlantic slave trade system. We'll be talking about the development of the Atlantic slave trade, and we'll be talking about the development of slavery, particularly in the North American colonies. We're going to be looking as well, in connection to that, to the British North American colonies. And we'll be doing some thinking about contrasting some of the developments in the New England colonies, as well as to developments in the founding and development of the Chesapeake colonies. The New England colonies, of course, centered around Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and, of course, the Chesapeake colonies centered primarily around Virginia and Maryland. This is in Chapter 3. And we will have a quiz this week, a reading quiz on Chapter 3. So please read the chapter and make highlights if you're able to, if you have a printed version. If not, you might be able to make notations in the PDF version of the book as well. But if you're able to take notes on your reading and or highlight the reading's important parts, it will help you prepare for these types of assignments. So there is a reading quiz this week on Chapter 3. Okay, so this starts what I think is kind of a fun activity during the term in this class, and this is an opportunity. I don't offer lots of extra credit, but I offer a little bit, and it helps out at the end of a term, and at the end of the term. And the way that extra credit works is like this. So every week you watch my announcements, and in the announcements I'll tell you a factoid about history, something relevant to what we're covering during the week. Then, in the discussion area and the content area, depending on where you want to access it, you will see a discussion forum that says post your extra credit fact here. And so what you do is, after you watch the announcements and you hear the factoids, you take notes, you write down the factoid, and then you go into that extra credit discussion board and just make a post. Say, this is the factoid for this week. It's not, you don't get point deducted or anything like this. It's just, this is the factoid for this week. And then I go in there and I put the bonus point in for you. Now, the way it works is, at the end of the term, I will put together all the bonus points. It'll usually be about 10 points. And I will add that to one of your test scores at the end of the term. So it provides a nice little extra sort of, extra little bump to one's final grade at the end of the term, 2, 3 grade points. So the factoid for this week, and the other important thing about this, you have to post that factoid by the end of the day on Wednesday at the latest. After that point, it closes, and you cannot post that factoid past that point. Why do I do this? The reason I do this is because I want everyone watching the announcements first. I want you to come into class, watch the announcements, figure out, okay, this is what we're doing this week. Engage a little bit with the topic and your teacher here in this case, and so I want you to start that early, because your success in the class will really, in a lot of cases, is facilitated by being involved in the class earlier, as opposed to waiting until the weekend to do everything. So make sure you post the factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight in the little extra credit factoid discussion forum. You'll see it in there. Here's the factoid. What we're reading about here this week, partially, it relates to the development of slavery. And as you'll notice in the reading, the development of slavery leads to the development of the modern concept of racism. Racism was not something that always exists. Instead, the way that racism developed and factored into the many problems associated with the United States since, racism was something that was developed in a particular time frame. It was a construct. It was created during a particular time period. And slavery in the Chesapeake, in places like Virginia and Maryland, factored in significantly to the roots of this construct that becomes the notion of the modern concept of racism, which has caused so many terrible problems in American society since. The factoid is, we're going to be reading about an event called Bacon's Rebellion. And Nathaniel Bacon was the leader of effectively a band of indentured servants. The Chesapeake colony's initial labor was, there were slaves, but a lot of the labor was based on indentured servitude. And indentured servitude meant that an individual who couldn't pay for their passage from England to come to North America would effectively have their passage paid by someone affiliated with an industry, or the shipping company, or the tobacco industry. And the person would come to the Chesapeake, and they would have to work for usually a duration of about 6 years. And then after the 6 years, the idea was they would gain their freedom, and then they would be able to access land. Well, by the time you get to the 1670s, there's a treaty in place between the Virginia colonial government and Native Americans to prevent further conflict. And as a result of that, there wasn't a lot of good land to go around for individuals that were coming out of indentured servitude. This leads to Nathaniel Bacon of ultimately waging a war against both the colonial government, really, and also Native Americans. He wanted the right to unleash a universal war on Native Americans so that these former indentured servants largely could claim that land that was Native American land to the west of Virginia and farm it. And so Nathaniel Bacon began this war, basically to have a universal war on Native Americans, so that landless individuals could seize the land, have land, and then have theoretically a basis for financial improvement. Ultimately, Nathaniel Bacon fails, though of course the war represents really the beginning of a almost perpetual expansion in the colonial period in through the United States' history as well. And we see a similar conflict, though it was motivated somewhat differently, in the New England colonies, what's called King Philip's War, at almost the exact same time in 1675 and 1676. Well, the New England colony was not really a colony where you saw a lot of slavery, because it just wasn't really, the environment it wasn't conducive to large-scale sort of agriculture using slaves. But of course, the Chesapeake colony was developing increasingly as a colony that centered around farming, and particularly the farming of tobacco. And increasingly after Bacon's Rebellion, you see the Chesapeake colonies move increasingly towards a widespread usage of slavery, African slaves, in the farming of tobacco. And this causes a shift in the Chesapeake, in which the Chesapeake, and then ultimately much of the South, or all of the South really, in the colonial times, transitions from being something what historians would call a society with slaves to being a slave society. A society with slaves to being a slave society. And what that meant was that prior to, say, Bacon's Rebellion, and it takes some time for the change to happen. It's not immediate after Bacon's Rebellion. But prior to Bacon's Rebellion, the Chesapeake was a colony that had a myriad of different forms of labor, indentured servants, and there were also slaves. After Bacon's Rebellion, because of the concern over the possible revolts of indentured servants, as happened with Bacon's Rebellion, you saw farming in the Chesapeake increasingly shift to a total reliance on slavery. And by the time you get into the mid-1700s, you're talking about a society in which really all of the farming was more or less being done by slaves. It had become a slave society. And it is from that that you see really the emergence of the roots of the modern notion of racism. Okay, I hope that's clear. Just summarize the factoid as best as you can in that extra credit discussion forum. I'll see everyone in the discussion forum this week. Don't forget quiz in chapter 3. This was a little bit long. Maybe I'll give you 2 points for this one because it was a bit long. But I'll see everyone in the discussion forum. Have a great week.